You stopped chasing, and that single decision changed everything. Not because you played games, not because you ignored her on purpose, but because you finally chose direction over desperation. When you were chasing, your energy was scattered. Your focus was on proving, pleasing, convincing. And the moment a man starts chasing approval, he gives away his power. But the moment you stopped, something shifted. Your life no longer revolved around whether she replied, noticed, or validated you. It revolved around where you were going. Leadership isn't loud, it's calm. It's the quiet certainty of a man who knows his purpose and moves toward it daily. When you stopped chasing, you naturally stepped into that energy. You didn't need to announce it, she felt it. Women are wired to respond to direction, not desperation. They don't fall in love with men who orbit around them. They fall in love with men who are grounded in their own mission, men who invite, not beg. Before, your attention was chasing her. Now, your attention is building something. And here's the truth most men don't understand: attention is currency. Where you place it determines your value. When you constantly give it away, it becomes cheap. When you invest it wisely, it becomes powerful. The moment you redirected your focus toward your growth, your goals, your standards, you became rare. And rarity creates attraction. You didn't become cold, you became selective. You didn't stop caring, you stopped overextending. And that balance is what changed how she saw you. Suddenly, she wasn't the center of your world, but she wasn't pushed out either. She was invited into a world that already had structure, momentum, and direction. That's what leadership feels like. It's not control, it's stability. When a man leads his own life, a woman doesn't feel pressure, she feels safety. She doesn't feel chased, she feels chosen. That's the difference. Chasing says, please want me. Leading says, this is where I'm going. You're welcome to walk beside me. And that energy is intoxicating because it removes uncertainty. It allows her to relax into her feminine space while you remain anchored in yours. You also stopped adjusting yourself to keep her interested. You stopped changing your pace to match her mood. You stayed consistent, calm, moving forward regardless of who was watching. And that consistency created respect. Respect turns into admiration. Admiration turns into emotional attachment. This is how attraction deepens quietly, steadily, without force. The moment you stopped chasing, she felt the shift. Not because you disappeared, but because you no longer needed to be seen to feel valuable. You were leading your life, and she didn't want to be left behind. That's when curiosity turned into interest. Interest turned into desire, and desire turned into emotional connection. So remember this: love doesn't grow when you chase it. It grows when you become the kind of man worth following. You learn to control your emotions instead of explaining them, and that decision quietly changed the entire dynamic between you and her. Before, every feeling needed words. Every misunderstanding needed clarification. Every moment of distance triggered a reaction. And without realizing it, you were giving away your emotional center. You were teaching her that your peace depended on her responses. But the moment you stopped doing that, something powerful happened. You became grounded. Emotional control doesn't mean emotional absence. It means you no longer react from insecurity. You no longer rush to fix, defend, or prove yourself. You stop turning feelings into arguments and silence into panic. Instead of explaining how you felt every time, you allowed your actions, your consistency, and your calm presence to speak. And that kind of strength is rare. Most men think explaining emotions creates connection. In reality, over-explaining creates dependence. It says, I need you to understand me so I can feel okay. When you stop doing that, you send a different message without saying a word. I understand myself. That self-awareness made you steady. And steadiness creates attraction. You didn't suppress emotions, you mastered them. You allowed feelings to pass without letting them control your behavior. You didn't text when you felt anxious. You didn't react when you felt uncertain. You didn't demand reassurance when things went quiet. You stayed present, calm, and observant. And that emotional discipline changed how she experienced you. When a woman senses that a man is emotionally centered, she feels safe to open up. Not because he explains everything, but because he doesn't collapse under pressure. Drama no longer pulls him off balance. Distance no longer triggers him. Uncertainty no longer makes him chase clarity. He stays composed, and composition is magnetic. You also stop trying to be understood at all costs. You realize that clarity doesn't come from words, it comes from behavior. So instead of long explanations, you became consistent. Instead of emotional speeches, you became reliable. Instead of reactions, you chose restraint. And restraint is one of the strongest forms of confidence. When you didn't react, she noticed. When you didn't defend yourself, she felt it. When you stayed calm in moments that used to shake you, it created a contrast she couldn't ignore. Your emotional control made you unpredictable, not chaotic but steady in a world of reactions. And unpredictability rooted in strength creates intrigue. You didn't argue your value. You lived it. You didn't demand understanding. You allowed space. And in that space, her emotions had room to grow. She began to think, to wonder, to feel. Because when a man isn't emotionally leaking, a woman starts emotionally investing. Your silence wasn't punishment, it was peace. Your calm wasn't distance, it was control. And control doesn't push love away, it anchors it. When you stopped explaining and started embodying emotional strength, she didn't feel confused. She felt drawn in. So remember this: mastery of emotion is not about hiding what you feel, but choosing when and how it deserves to be expressed. You gave her space, and instead of losing her, you allowed her emotions to finally breathe. Most men fear space because they associate it with distance, rejection, or loss. So they fill every gap with messages, explanations, and constant presence. But what you understood, whether consciously or not, is that attraction doesn't grow in pressure, it grows in freedom. When you stepped back, you didn't disappear. You simply stopped hovering, and that changed everything. Space is not absence. Space is room. Room for her to feel, room for her to think, room for her emotions to move without interference. Before, your constant availability left no room for curiosity. She never had time to wonder about you because you were always there. But the moment you gave her space, her mind began to fill that silence with thoughts of you. Silence has weight when it comes from strength. You weren't silent because you were afraid to speak. You were silent because you were comfortable not forcing connection. And that kind of silence is powerful. It creates contrast. It makes your presence meaningful again. When you speak less but with intention, your words land deeper. By giving her space, you showed emotional maturity. You showed that you trust her process and your own value. You didn't chase reassurance. You didn't demand constant contact. You allowed things to unfold naturally. And that calm confidence sent a clear message: you are secure within yourself. When a woman feels pressured, her emotions shut down. When she feels free, her emotions open up. Your space removed pressure. It removed the need for her to manage your feelings. She didn't feel responsible for your happiness anymore, and that relief allowed attraction to return. Desire cannot exist where obligation lives. You also allowed mystery to re-enter the connection. Mystery isn't manipulation. It's the natural result of a man who has a full life beyond one person. When you weren't always available, she began to wonder what you were doing, where your energy was going, and why you seemed so centered. Curiosity is the beginning of emotional attachment. The space you gave her made your presence valuable again. When you did connect, it felt intentional, not automatic. She felt chosen, not chased. And that distinction matters deeply. Being chased creates pressure. Being chosen creates desire. You didn't use space to punish or provoke a reaction. You used it to stay aligned with yourself. And because it wasn't forced, it felt natural to her. She didn't feel abandoned. She felt intrigued. She didn't feel ignored. She felt the shift in energy. Her emotions began to move because you stopped trying to control them. You allowed her to come toward you at her own pace. And when a woman moves emotionally on her own, the connection becomes deeper and more real. What she chooses, she values. What she chases emotionally, she protects. By stepping back, you let her step forward. By staying grounded, you became the calm she didn't know she needed. And in that quiet space, attraction didn't fade, it intensified. Sometimes the strongest move isn't to speak, chase, or prove anything. It's to give space and let emotions do the work. You chose self-respect over attention, and that choice quietly rewired how she saw you. There was a time when attention felt like validation, when any message, any sign of interest felt necessary to keep the connection alive. But you reached a point where you understood something deeper. Attention that costs your dignity is never worth it. The moment you stopped tolerating confusion, mixed signals, and emotional inconsistency, your energy changed. Self-respect is not about arrogance or control. It's about clarity. You became clear about what you accept and what you don't. You stopped bending your standards just to stay connected. You didn't argue your boundaries. You simply lived by them. And when a man lives by his standards without apology, people either rise to meet him or feel his absence. Before, you might have accepted less just to keep her close. You might have stayed quiet about things that bothered you, hoping it would pass. But self-respect doesn't negotiate with discomfort. It listens to it. You stopped ignoring your intuition. You stopped rewarding inconsistency with more effort. And that shift created a line she could feel, even if you never spoke it out loud. When you chose self-respect, you stopped chasing attention that came with uncertainty. You no longer needed constant reassurance. You didn't settle for half interest or emotional breadcrumbs. And that didn't push her away, it made her pause. Because when a man doesn't beg for attention, his presence becomes something to earn. A woman may test boundaries, consciously or unconsciously, to see where a man stands with himself. When you passed that test by standing firm, something changed. She didn't feel challenged, she felt grounded. Your self-respect communicated strength, and strength creates emotional safety. She knew where you stood because you knew where you stood. You also stopped overgiving. You stopped pouring energy into situations that weren't aligned. You matched effort with effort, interest with interest. Not out of strategy, but out of self-value. And balance like that creates harmony. It removes resentment. It allows attraction to breathe without force. Self-respect also changed how you reacted to uncertainty. Instead of trying harder, you stepped back. Instead of demanding clarity, you allowed actions to reveal truth. That patience showed maturity. It showed that you trust yourself enough to walk away if needed. And nothing creates attraction faster than a man who doesn't fear his own absence. When you chose self-respect, you became emotionally unavailable to chaos, but fully available to depth. You weren't cold. You were selective. You weren't distant. You were aligned. And alignment is attractive because it feels real. She didn't fall for you because you demanded respect. She fell because you embodied it. You showed her, without words, that you value yourself, and people naturally value those who value themselves first. Always remember, attention fades quickly, but self-respect creates a presence that lingers long after silence. You became grounded instead of reactive, and that inner shift changed how every situation unfolded between you. Before, emotions from the outside could pull you off center. A delayed reply could affect your mood. A change in tone could trigger overthinking. Uncertainty felt like something you had to fix immediately. But grounding yourself meant you no longer lived at the mercy of external signals. You learned to stay steady, no matter what was happening around you. Being grounded doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you don't get dragged by every emotion that passes through you. You began responding instead of reacting. You allowed moments to settle before you spoke. You gave yourself time to observe rather than rush to conclusions. And in that space between stimulus and response, your power returned. Reactivity comes from fear, fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. When you were reactive, you were trying to control outcomes. You wanted certainty, you wanted reassurance. But control never creates connection. Stability does. And when you became stable within yourself, you no longer needed to manage every emotional fluctuation in the connection. Your grounded presence changed how she felt around you. When drama appeared, you didn't escalate it. When tension surfaced, you didn't absorb it. When emotions ran high, you stayed calm. And calm is contagious. A woman can relax emotionally when she knows a man won't collapse under pressure. She can open up when she feels held by stability instead of chaos. You also stopped taking everything personally. Silence wasn't rejection anymore. Mood shifts weren't threats. Distance wasn't a crisis. You understood that emotions move, situations change, and not everything requires a response. That emotional intelligence made you feel safe to be around, and safety is the foundation of deep attraction. Grounded men don't seek control, they create balance. You didn't argue to be right, you didn't defend your ego. You let things unfold while staying aligned with yourself. That neutrality was powerful because it showed confidence. You trusted yourself enough to let events reveal truth without interference. When tests came, you didn't react emotionally. You observed. You remained present without losing yourself. And that response, or lack of reaction, communicated strength. It showed that your emotional center was internal, not dependent on external validation. And that kind of independence is deeply attractive. Your grounded state also allowed you to lead without force. You didn't need to raise your voice, push your opinion, or dominate conversations. Your energy spoke first. Leadership rooted in calm doesn't demand attention, it naturally draws it. By staying grounded, you became predictable in the best way. Not boring but reliable. Not rigid but consistent. She knew where you stood emotionally, and that clarity allowed trust to grow. Trust deepens attraction because it removes fear. You didn't become indifferent. You became intentional. You didn't withdraw emotionally. You anchored emotionally. And in a world full of reactive energy, your calm stood out. Remember this: when you master your reactions, you master the emotional direction of the connection. You let her discover you instead of trying to impress her, and that shift changed the emotional depth of the connection. Before, like most men, you may have felt the need to prove your value through words, effort, or constant demonstrations of interest. You showed your best parts too quickly, explained your intentions too clearly, and tried to secure attraction through performance. But real attraction doesn't grow from being impressed. It grows from being discovered. When you stopped trying to impress, you stopped selling yourself. You no longer rushed to show everything you were capable of. You allowed layers to exist. You let moments unfold naturally instead of forcing connection. And that patience created intrigue. Mystery returned not as a tactic but as a result of self-assurance. Discovery creates emotional investment because it requires participation. When a woman feels like she's uncovering you piece by piece, her mind becomes engaged. She thinks, she wonders, she feels. But when everything is revealed up front, there's nothing left to explore. You understood that depth isn't built in a rush, it's built in time. You didn't hide who you were. You simply stopped over explaining it. You let your actions reveal your character. You let consistency speak for you. You allowed silence to carry meaning. And because of that, every interaction felt intentional rather than desperate. Trying to impress puts a man in a lower position. It silently asks for approval. But allowing discovery places you on equal ground, or higher, because you are comfortable being seen gradually. That comfort communicates confidence. And confidence doesn't chase attention, it attracts curiosity. You also stopped oversharing. Not because you became guarded, but because you trusted timing. You knew that some things are more powerful when revealed naturally. Emotional depth was no longer forced, it was invited. And when emotional connection is invited, it's respected. As she discovered you, she began attaching emotion to effort. The more she invested emotionally, the more valuable the connection became to her. This is how attachment grows, not through persuasion, but through participation. What she feels she uncovers herself becomes meaningful. Your calm presence, your grounded reactions, your boundaries, your silence, all of it created a sense of depth. She felt like there was more beneath the surface. And depth creates desire because it suggests something real, something lasting. You didn't rush intimacy. You didn't rush clarity. You allowed comfort to grow before closeness. And that pacing made the connection feel safe yet exciting, predictable yet intriguing, balanced. When a woman discovers a man instead of being sold to, she doesn't feel overwhelmed. She feels curious. She doesn't feel pressured. She feels drawn in. And that emotional pull is stronger than any attempt to impress. You didn't change who you were, you changed how you allowed yourself to be known. And that made all the difference. Always remember, attraction deepens when you allow discovery, not when you demand admiration.